don't do a lot of interviews on the Wade Show. I think I've only done one before, but when Jeremy Carl's in town,
wow,
we got to set aside everything.
I'm especially honored.
Well, so we're here. We're talking about your new book, The Unprotected Class: How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. So, how do you feel? First question: how do you feel about this branding move? So this like personal, you've taken a big turn in your personal brand in the last few months. How do you feel about it?
Well, I mean, I think that sort of was in my brand. I mean, we talked a little bit off camera about how I've done a number of other things, including in the Trump administration on matters totally unrelated to this. So, but I've been writing about this stuff for over a decade, and that was the brand is, I guess, maybe that's some peripheral issue, but I was more focused on, I felt like this was a message that really needed to get out, that it was important, and that I was qualified to write on it, and so I didn't see anybody else stepping forward, so I did.
Yeah, you talked before. You talk in the book about how when you were writing it, pitching it, there were a lot of people around you who said, like, "Sounds like a great idea, but what?"
Yeah. I mean, well, I got a lot of but whats, but I think probably the most common but what was, a white guy really shouldn't write this book. Sure. And before some of her recent controversies, Candace Owens' name came up a lot, or somebody like that. And I actually felt like it was really important that we are allowed to speak for ourselves. And in fact, I mean, I think that there's a lot of folks, I'm not, Candace Owens and Shelby Steele are pretty different types of people, but, there are a lot of minorities of various stripes who, of course, could write eloquently on this and issues like this, and in fact, some of them have. But I felt that it was very important to say, hey, we can speak out in our own defense and talk about our own issues and not apologize for that. And that a lot of the problems that we have right now are actually that we're kind of being told, hey, you're not really allowed to say that. You said before that you've written on this before, and that you said in other interviews that you felt some level of calling to do this, or but that you only recently sort of accepted that. Is there a sense in which, because I think you said it was 10 years ago or so that you first started thinking about doing this book? Or were you writing? I've been writing about this issue for probably more than 10 years now. I've been thinking about issues like this and talking about it for 20 years now, since I lived in India and sort of saw how their caste politics bore a lot of resemblance to our racial politics. But I mean, there wasn't like I was like, oh gosh, I've got to write this book. Even 10 years ago, but maybe 10 years ago I was like, somebody needs to write this book. Sure. And I hope it's somebody who's not me, because I don't want to go into the fire. And then at a certain point, I mean, we were talking again off camera about it was a little bit like Jonah and Nineveh, and eventually, like, I was like, okay, well, God is telling me to go preach in Nineveh and tell them to repent of their evil ways, and I just need to do it and not be disobedient. Well, and then even in Jonah, with the delays, Jonah did still come at the right time. And so I'm curious to think to what your thoughts are on. Are you glad at some level that you waited? Because the book itself has a lot of examples in it from recent years. It's just since you started. Sure. I mean, I could have used older stuff, obviously, and I did. I mean, there is some older stuff in there, but I was trying to be as current as possible. That is an interesting question. I've gotten a lot of folks who say, "Wow, you timed the market really well. Sure, this book came at the right time." That was certainly not the intention. It was just, I guess, I mean, God does everything in His own time, and maybe that was just fated that I wasn't going to write that until the world was ready for whatever small contribution I could give to it. And so maybe it all worked out for the best in that respect. Well, I really enjoyed the book, and I'm really glad you wrote it. I had a question. I mean, obviously, you've done a ton of interviews after you've seen some pushback from folks, and I was curious what you thought was the strongest of those criticisms. Again, I love the book. So that's a good question. I think the strongest of those criticisms might be different than the most frequent of the criticisms. Okay, sure. Gosh, if there were any really strong criticisms, I felt like I would have addressed them in the book. Sure. No, it's a thorough book. No. I mean, of course, there's always things you could do better. I would have loved to have been maybe even more comprehensive and slightly more theoretical. Okay. I mean, it's a very empirical book. It's a little bit light on theory, although I do have some theory. So maybe I I'd say that like really tying this more deeply into other similar phenomena we might have witnessed in other cultures or things. This is what I'm thinking about kind of for a follow-up book. So so maybe speaking as an academic for a second, but probably not from a reader's perspective, we would say this is under-theorized would be a criticism. But from a reader's perspective, perhaps that would make it a lot more readable. And I think a lot of people, if you read the reviews of the book, people comment that it's an extremely readable book. So
well, I want to get back to the follow-up book later on. One I think some people might see the title, they might see the book on a shelf. I think they're selling it at Costco, that kind of thing. We're talking about that. But like they might see that and think that, okay, this guy is just doing the white version of Ibram X. Kendi.
Right.
Like you're just doing, obviously you're not doing like, pro-white baby or whatever. But at some level, like, in what ways is your project? We both would agree the destructiveness of Ibram X. Kendi's project.
Correct.
But how is your project different from that in character and in substance?
Right, and I think so that would actually get to maybe the most frequent criticism I would get of the book, which I don't think is a good criticism, and it's frankly often from people who haven't even read the book.
Sure.
Which is, you're just creating another victim class. Right. And I really kind of went out of my way, both in the book and in particular in my interviews about the book, to say, hey, I'm not creating a new victim class here. I'm not trying to whine to the refs. I'm not trying to do all these things. I think that that's toxic and destructive for a variety of reasons. On the other hand, if we're being discriminated against, we need to be men enough to call it out and tell people to stop. And so I'm trying to do that in the name, again, not of sort of special rights for white people, but because white people have just as much rights to their inalienable rights under the Constitution as any other group. And so I'm going to call that out when I see that not happening.
You said that one of the touchstones for this was Thomas Sowell's affirmative action
around the world, an empirical essay.
Yeah, and I was curious. Just sort of how it shows, and Thomas Sowell shows that this cosmic justice approach is universal.
Right.
So that's not something that's particular to any one particular group. So in what ways is your project, again, not part of that, an alternative quest for cosmic justice?
Right. No, and in fact, I quote that very quote from Thomas Sowell in the book, The Quest for Cosmic Justice, leading to greater injustice. I mean, it's because I kind of deny the entire validity of that construct where you're saying, well, there was some bad thing that happened in the past, so we're trying to equal it out.
Right.
I mean, there's a variety of complications and incorrect things about even just assuming that in American context. But even if we assumed it was true, which I do not, I mean, not that there weren't, I do, of course, assume there were bad things in the American past, but it's just, I don't, I wouldn't balance it in the way that some other people might. But that in doing that, what we really need to do instead is to treat everybody as equally as we can, with equal laws and equal rights. And that's not a kind of quest to say, oh, well, this group was favored at this time, or we favored this group, or we did this thing, but just we should treat everybody with equal dignity.
Well, and I think that part of what might make some folks nervous about the taking away affirmative action and that kind of thing, I think some folks might not be pleased when they see the results of those, like if you do have equal standards. And so a lot of what's happening is people trying to even out the standards. And such that there's no kind of impact or no kind of disparate impact or whatever. That seems like your project is just okay with the results of applying equal standards.
Well, okay, so real talk and confession beyond what I would put in the book, not because I was trying to keep it secret in the book, but just because it opens up a whole other can of worms. I think that most people would not be okay in some particularly meritocratic processes with the results of those processes if we were to truly do them in a race-blind, race-neutral way. I think that's another way of saying people have no idea how big the elephant is on the scale that is weighing against white people to a lesser extent, or a different extent, sometimes Asian Americans as well, in these type of processes, and that it wouldn't be comfortable for them. So as a practical matter, I would personally be okay with doing that nonetheless, because I just think it's the right thing to do. Putting on my hat as somebody who has participated in a serious way in politics what I would say is realistically what's going to happen at best is this. You're going to take the half to 2/3, I'm making up that number, but it's ballpark correct, of people who are really kind of dramatically less qualified who are getting in under these processes. And you're going to eliminate those guys.
Yeah.
But you're still going to have some people who are kind of marginally less qualified who are going to get positions because it's just going to make people feel more comfortable as a society. I don't even know that it's necessarily the wrong thing for society, given that we're a political society. So I think I want to be very, very clear. This is not my personal advocacy, but I think that this is the most likely durable political solution that would actually be good that we could do around these issues.
In your the book again is very thorough. It goes through a lot of topics. I mean, your background is in environmental studies and environmental policy. And so there's a chapter there. And so I was surprised to see that chapter in the book personally. But I think some folks,
probably just because I do have a background, so because I know it all there.
And that's and I think that I think some people might have seen anti-whiteness or something like that in some particular realm. So there may be somebody who's a big movie fan and they've been tracking, or like entertainment, and they're annoyed by some kind of casting decision. And other folks who are more passionate about history and recognizing that kind of thing. But what I love about the book is that it's it jumps around to all these different areas and shows that it's happening everywhere. Were there any places, any topics that you were surprised by? You said there are 11 chapters, or 11 sort of
11
parts of the
subject
case.
matter chapters.
Subject matter chapters.
And that was very conscious, by the way. I mean, and I say this in the sort of introductory material to the book. I mean, certain of these chapters, not everything, but some of the chapters have been like kind of written as an entire book. But it's kind of people touching a part of the elephant, the blind man. And what I'm trying to do in putting all of this together in a sort of survey course type way is say, hey, the elephant's an elephant, and we should talk about the elephant in the room. So that was a very conscious decision on my part.
And were you surprised by any? Did you add a chapter later where you thought like, oh, I didn't even think to do that originally?
There's some chapters I would have loved to have, like the media, especially because the media couldn't have resisted covering it. That was probably like PR malpractice on my part not to do a long chapter on the media. But I didn't. So there were certainly things I could have added. But I would say maybe the pervasiveness in the military was a little surprising and disappointing, because the military has a reputation, not entirely unearned, of being better on issues around race, desegregating earlier than the rest of society, having more interracial friendships of all types. But it really became clear that particularly in recent years, there's a lot of problems in the military. And you're seeing this just in the last 5 years. You've had a 40% drop in the number of white recruits as white parents, particularly if they have themselves been in the military, kind of saying, hey, I don't really want to sign my kid up for this. They're not going to get killed for this.
And the military itself losing out on a lot of these great young men.
Of course. And disproportionately, white soldiers tend to be the so-called tip of the spear. So they're a significant portion of the military to begin with, but they're like 80% of special forces. So you're disproportionately losing recruits that are coming into that group. So it's a not just a justice issue, but it's a military readiness issue.
In some ways, I think this book is touching on a huge point in American identity. So what it means to be an American, and which has always been a thorny topic since the beginning. And America as one thing, is sort of there were plenty of bloody conflicts about what American was and what. So in what way is this a particular? So like I said, it goes back. So the question of American identity being a thorny topic for a long time. In what way is this something new, and in what way is this a continuation of that earlier problem that you're figuring out how to solve?
Well, I think there obviously are elements that you just touched on that are continual. I'd say that part of the new element that I'd say is the most problematic is that we're denying that even our historical American identity is a good thing. And when I say we, I don't mean you and me. But I mean,
I didn't do it.
Kind of the Borg out there. And so, like, there are two problems with any sort of, I talk about this particularly in my immigration chapter. I mean, even if you had a strongly assimilatory environment, assimilating this number of people into America, this number of immigrants, illegal and otherwise. I mean, I think we should just deport the illegals, but that's a separate question. That would be an enormous challenge. When you don't even have the confidence to say, hey, the thing that we're asking you to join is a really good thing, and it has, historically it's been a good thing, and of course it has problems, and we can talk about those problems.
Right.
But when we don't even have our own cultural confidence, that is a kind of fatal combination.
Right. And that would be different from, again, a time where the main unifying problem was that states were different.
Sure.
And people had different identities. So there may be a particular state that has a lot of Germanic immigrants.
Right.
But trying to get together all of these people, it's not that there are constantly new crowds from all over different places. It's how do we get this group to incorporate and also get what they have to bring to it as well.
And the differences were narrower. And I say that with all due respect to not trying to pretend that in the sort of European immigration history of the U.S., which is basically 1607 in Jamestown to 1965, you can go back and you'll see plenty of people bemoaning, particularly when we get, starting in the 1880s, the first real large groups of immigrant from outside of Northwestern Europe. They're definitely bemoaning the different cultural customs or whatever that people are bringing. So I'm not trying to pretend that was easy, but the distance is still a lot shorter, and the cultural distance is a lot shorter.
And there's the question of mass and scale.
Yeah, mass and scale. But also, I mean, they shared, and they took for granted that they shared, in the vast majority of cases, things like they were all Christians. You know, they all had a certain, not all, but, you know, there was a certain kind of heritage through ancient Rome culturally for at least a lot of them. I mean, even not just the ones from Western Europe. And when you compare that to, say, like Somalis coming in today to Scandinavian Minnesota, I mean, that's just a much bigger cultural distance, and we should be honest about that. Bigger
cultural difference as well as a numerical difference. So the problem is coming from both directions.
Correct.
Which makes perfect sense. So you talk in the book about how many of the things that are that you'd like to see changed are just people responding to incentive structures.
Right.
So that there are, it's natural based on everything that's around them.
Right.
And in what ways would you say are there are plenty of ways, and you go through much of this in the book, but in what ways are the incentive structures broken that might be some kind of tie throughout? So there are many different incentive structures in all these different places. Yeah. In what way is there some kind of common brokenness
thing?
In that? Or is it legal? Is that the common factor? Like there's sort of legal encouragement?
Certainly it's a matter of law. That's a lot of it. I'd say kind of underlying a lot of this is a flight from white, or a desire to get away from whiteness that really undergirds a lot of these incentive structures. So if people perceived that it was positive to kind of join a broader American community that had its roots in Europe, we would see more of that. And it's funny because I talk about white fragility and white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. It's not an accident that you begin to see the term white privilege is introduced by Peggy McIntosh, an academic at Wellesley, in the 1980s. You get that right as anything resembling white privilege on a net basis is going away, right?
Okay,
like when you really did have white privilege, and by the way, you did, sure, at the turn of the century. I mean, I don't want to be reductive because that wouldn't have been your most important privilege potentially. I mean, if you had money or whatever else, or education, those would also be really important privileges. But certainly it was a net benefit. I don't think anybody would argue at the turn of the century if you were white. And so you had people trying to pass for white who were not of solely European extraction. But now here in 2024, when white privilege is definitely not a thing, and it's quite the reverse, now you have people screaming about white privilege all the time, and that's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
Right.
The subtitle of the book, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. It seems to me that you've said this before in other interviews, that this book is not for white people as such.
Right.
It's a book about people who care that America might be being torn apart.
Sure.
So you're proving that America is being torn apart, and saying something that may not be said. It may be surprising to folks that it is.
Yeah.
But if you care, it seems like if you care about America and the future of it, you'd want to know if America is being torn apart by something. But have you run across folks who, in doing the promotion and writing the book, the American centeredness of it, it's sort of like, if you want to preserve America, if you love America, we have to stop hating the historical stock of the folks who were here the longest. Is that, it seems to me self-evident. But why is that such a tough sell?
Well, I think it's natural, and I'm glad that you mentioned this, because it's definitely not a book that I just wrote for white people, because I just take it, I say this explicitly within the book, that if we don't have, like, if every single white person in America bought this book, read it, was totally convinced by the argument, would not solve the problem.
Sure.
Because you need some sort of an American consensus on this. And so I definitely welcome people of all different colors and backgrounds to read this book. You can be fully convinced by it. You can be partially convinced by it. It can just be thought-provoking, and you're unconvinced by it. But you're like, oh, wow, there's crazy white people who actually think this. That is the necessary step for a sort of reconciliation as an American people that I think is absolutely critical. Then you go back and you say, well, so why is this going on? To me, it is a natural human phenomena. You show up here and you're Somalian. I'm not trying to pick on the Somalians, but we're just you doing this, right? Like
the Captain Phillips guys are going to get offended by this.
Right. It's like everybody, when you look at your country, when you look at your community, when you tell your story, you want your ancestors to be the heroes of that story. I'm not saying that is like universal or that it's unbreakable, but I think this is just a natural human tendency. It's not an evil tendency or a vindictive tendency that some terrible group of immigrants have. It's just natural. You want you and your family to be the heroes of that story. Well, if you're Somali and you're looking at the first 300 years of, you're absent from that story, right? You just are. Now, you can say, well, there are African Americans there, and that's absolutely true, but they're even largely from different parts of Africa, and they're here not usually as full citizens and whatever. So you're not usually going to have that identification.
And if you've come in, then you've abandoned a place where your people were celebrated. There was a history there. And so you come where there's none.
Right. So you come where there's none. And so what do? What you have to do is say, I'm going to tear down, literally in some cases, those statues. I'm going to tear down that history, and I'm going to say that history was really bad, evil. Now, when my folks show up, this is when America sort of redeems itself. Barack Obama used that type of rhetoric quite explicitly, actually. I particularly remember Michelle Obama kind of giving a very grandiloquent speech where she kind of made points in this direction. So that's just going on, and it's a natural tendency, but it's also a very destructive tendency when you apply it to the whole country.
Yeah. You mentioned you would like to do a follow-up book, and you said there were a couple of different ways you were thinking about going. This one in particular, the book you just finished, the book that's out now, I think establishes something that people have been feeling for a while, or maybe, again, like I said, from their particular sphere, and then seeing how broad it is. I think that well, before we talk about the follow-up, your point about history, I think that's a really great case study on just why Americans might be okay with some of their statues being torn down. Because if it seems like there's a natural, obviously, affinity for where people come from, and they don't like. It's natural to not necessarily want your story to be told. But it seems like there's also an underlying sort of ingratitude in Americans for where they're coming from. And so that ingratitude is really easy to grab onto. So that they're not coming in with some amount of, it's not just, again, this outside force that comes in and tells people, hey, you're bad. And there is an outside force, but that outside force is grabbing onto sort of a dishonoring your father and mother, you know, like ingratitude for what you have. And then when that meets with envy or malice, that's a really, those things were always going to clash. And those can clash in particularly American ways. Immigration can happen that way. But can you talk a little bit about this, again, how history serves as I think that was an important chapter. I just was curious if you could expound on that a little bit.
Well, this is an interesting point that it's a young country.
Yeah.
And we don't sort of have the great deep appreciation for our history in many cases. Again, whenever you talk like this, you're obviously generalizing. Okay.
Sure.
But we don't have that deep sense of Americans belonging to history. I mean, most of us, if we can't directly connect ourselves to somebody who is not American, it's sort of, at least you've got a picture of them in your family, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, not everybody. There are plenty of people whose whole family have been here since 1620 or whatever, but or maybe not plenty, but a fair number. But for a lot of us, and so there is this kind of narrower connection. I remember my father telling me something about like Europe was kind of the land where everybody loved their fathers, and America's the land where everybody hated their fathers and wanted to get away from them. Not with respect, I should hasten to add, to our own relationship, which was great. But,
but it's a good line. Right,
but just a good line that like, you know, that we are a country that probably has a natural tendency to build something new and to kind of, you know, throw the old stuff on the ash heap of history.
Right.
And so that makes us particularly susceptible to bad actors in the historical realm.
Yeah. And then back to the follow-up book question. Sorry, I jumped off of that earlier. But you mentioned also that you'd like to do something about this issue internationally.
Yeah.
And I'm so curious about what that would look like, or like your brainstorming process for what that.
Well, and that's new because I had another book, and I still want to do this as a follow-up. But the international stuff sort of came out because I thought, well, I'm writing about America. I kind of had in my mind, you know, this probably will not have huge international legs necessarily because it's an American story. So I was very surprised by the number of media inquiries I've gotten on this book from England, from France, from Hungary, from Germany, et cetera. And so I was like, well, you know, actually there's a bigger story here. And I was, of course, aware of that. But I think you could tell a story that is similar, although it will be very different in certain important ways. And I'll have to, once I get like 2 minutes that I'm not doing media on this book, I'll sit down.
Sorry,
and really
we're keeping you from it right now.
No, this is great. I mean, because this is the book I've got out right now, and I want people to read it.
Totally.
But the same thing's happening in Canada. The same thing's happening in Australia. The same thing's happening in UK and France. And in many ways, actually, they're less equipped to deal with it. We actually, I think, are institutionally as a country better able to like kind of say, you get to be an American, right? Like I'm just thinking now, you know, I have Chinese American friends who've traveled to China. And these are people like born in the United States, completely culturally American. And they would go to China and they would like not be seen as real Americans in important ways by the Chinese people.
Sure.
And like they would kind of be slighted in certain ways in favor of some white guy they're traveling with. Because that, you know, I think we are much better in a country saying, you know, look, that guy's an American, period. Right. Like it's, and I'm not trying to be too cute here and say, oh, the race doesn't matter. I mean, at the margin it can, but like if you are just a guy with super American traditional interests, and you know, particularly I'd say if you're Christian, you follow the kind of majority religion and a few other things, and you happen to have a different skin color, people are going to see you as American. At least other Americans will. And I think other countries, like particularly with say something like French, I mean, France has an ethnic history of a very particular people with a very particular culture and ancestry that goes back 1,500 years. Yeah, I certainly did the Franks. So
then an ethnogenesis had happened.
Right, ethnogenesis had happened, and now you're taking these groups that are really different in many cases, and you're saying, you get to be just as French as these guys. That's a harder pill, I think, for the French to swallow than it is for us Americans. I think we have a better ability to integrate that. So in any case, when I'm doing this book, I'll have to explore all of these items and all of their particularities.
And I think that it's been interesting You talked about Alex Kashuda,
Yeah.
and it's sort of BLM protests outside of her house. And where was it again?
She's in Romania.
In Romania,
and not even in Bucharest. I'm not going to dox her.
Sure. Yeah.
But
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
No. It's fine. Okay. It's fine that she's in Romania.
In
I can
the
say
country.
I can say that, but I just don't want to say the specific city
sorry,
she's
Alex,
in.
Yeah.
See, Alex, I'm on your side.
Yeah, appreciate it.
She's sensitive about that. But like her provincial city in Romania, they would have there are no black people there, but they have Black Lives Matter protests.
And so at some level, I mean, you talk in the book and you talked in other interviews about how we, through immigration, have imported a lot of the world's racial conflicts here.
Sure.
And it seems like we've also exported our own racial conflict, or at least like our ideas about
the world's leading importer and exporter.
Exactly. Yeah. We're just racial conflict just comes in and out. But that seems obviously a different process because we're not sending immigrants over to Romania to do this. But is it just social media?
It's our dominant cultural position.
Okay.
It's we're the media capital, we're the entertainment capital, we're the social media capital, we're the innovation capital. All these things. I mean, again, America. One of the reasons to write this book is we've got a lot of assets as a country.
Right.
This is the Edmund Burke. There's a great deal of ruin in a nation. I mean, we've got, there's a lot further we can fall. So I don't want us to fall there.
And we don't want to introduce our mess into Romania in a provincial Romanian town
that as well.
Yeah. In thinking about this book, you talked about the uniqueness of this situation. Right? Yeah. And I think that folks, when faced with a unique situation, it's difficult because you're always kind of grasping for some models.
Right.
You always want to know, okay, well, this actually happened in such and such, and we might be able to learn negative lessons from other places. But are there any positive role models in history of like, okay, a people that started a country and then basically decided that was a bad thing that they did that, and then were convinced the other way as well. Are there any positive examples of such and such a country turned this around?
Well, I'll give you a positive and negative example of kind of dealing with a multi-ethnic empire, which is the ancient Roman Empire. Yeah, like that was a very multicultural, multi-ethnic place successfully for quite a while. And I would add, and I talk about this in the immigration chapter, Peter Heather, who's a very distinguished historian in the UK, basically says the fall of the Roman Empire happens even though they'd always had migration. But like they begin to get really uncontrolled migration. The immigrants begin doing jobs that Romans don't want to do. And he shows how this pretty directly leads, in the case of some people fleeing the Huns, et cetera, to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So that's a bad thing. In terms of ethnogenesis, I think it happens all the time, and you don't even have a sense of it because today it's a more unified area. I mean, let me pick actually an extreme example where this hasn't happened and may not ever fully happen, but it's just so much better than it used to be, which would be Ireland and Northern Ireland. And people have talked about, we're going to unite Ireland maybe at some point in the not incredibly distant future. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why that may or may not happen. But for those of us who are a little older, we remember when the Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland were busy blowing each other up and various folks offing members of the British royal family because the anger over those divisions that did exist between Protestant and Catholic was so significant. And now those have been tremendously, tremendously lessened, I think, although they're certainly still there. So I think there's all sorts of examples that you could come up with that are probably even a lot better than that. That was just what I kind of thought of off the top of my head.
And the example of those hostilities have been lessened by what?
So there was active diplomacy that went on, and I think there was, maybe the bad side is like, Protestant versus Catholic in a secularizing world just became less important.
Felt antiquated.
Right, it felt antiquated. But I think there's all sorts of cultural unifying figures who can come in. A great one that's sort of notorious and was not permanent, but I just think it shows how much one figure can make a difference is Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia came in and tamed for quite some time all of the ethnic squabbles that had plagued the Balkans.
Yeah.
And as soon as he was sort of pushed to the side, they all emerged again, right?
Sure.
So I'm not saying he didn't have a permanent solution to that, but eventually, I mean, people do create nationalisms, and at some point they do fray around the edge. But there are plenty of examples, and we just don't even think of them because today it's like, well, France is France, but actually, if you look at the history of France, and I'm not even going to attempt to do it all, but no, it was actually the Kingdom of Burgundy and the Kingdom of Calais and whatever else, and they, they all had a tenuous connection to each other, and maybe they didn't even all speak what we would consider French, and now we're just like, well, that's France. So over time, it can happen for sure.
And the threat that you're pointing out here to that ethnogenesis, is any kind of love for the group of people that's been here the longest, or at least has kind of built a place. And we talked a little bit about also the I want to wrap up here. Let's end on this one. The before the Hart-Celler Act, and kind of the force that was there, and that is a way of actually creating some amount of ethnogenesis. At least from what I could tell in your book, you thought that. Can you talk a little bit about immigration? And I know it's an issue that's close to your heart. And how the negative effect of Hart-Celler, but also that there was a window in there, where some kind of coherence started to happen.
So not every subject in this book was I expert in. I mean, I knew enough about it. I mean, I'm a very widely read person. That's probably one of my strengths as an author. So I could at least make a reasonable attempt, but definitely not all of it. Immigration is one of those areas that I really do have a fair bit of independent expertise. And so that was kind of a important and interesting chapter to write. And I also think that probably nothing could be as fundamental to help us as getting control of our border, as deporting people who are here illegally, and just getting control of our immigration system. So I sort of walk through, there's a lot of myths about America being a nation of immigrants, and I walk through why this is actually just a 1960 Democrat campaign slogan and doesn't actually bear resemblance to the very complicated in and out history of immigration. And I talk about the difference between immigration and settlement, which is really critically important. And I do think that it's tremendously important to look at that immigration in a holistic way. As you alluded to, so you have all this immigration, it begins to get out of control in the late 19th and early 20th century, because basically at independence, America is about 85% British, as best we can tell, among citizen population, I should add. So this is excluding Native Americans and non-free African Americans, which is most African Americans at the time. So it's much more of an ethnic monolith. And then even through the late 19th century, I have the correct numbers in the book, but I'm going to make them up now. They're roughly correct. Is like through 1881, it was 85% of immigration was from Northwestern Europe.
Okay. And
it's really only after that you begin to get immigration even from other parts of Europe at a mass scale. So at that point, people begin to say, wow, this is kind of getting a little bit different. And this culminates in 1924 in the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. And this is the strictest immigration act that we've ever put in place in the United States. And it ties immigration in such a way to really preserve the cultural and ethnic balance of the country. And it's effective. It actually works. And as a result, that, and I think combined with World War II kind of being a thing that sort of nationalizes the American character to a degree, throws these people in as soldiers from all sorts of different parts of the country who might not have otherwise been exposed to each other. I don't think it's a coincidence that at the end of that process, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, this is like the stereotype that they'll play in commercials of like the all-American mom and dad and the picket fence and two kids, because all of these immigrants have come and they've Americanized.
Right.
And there's not that many of them either, by the way. We're down to, in 1970, a 4.7% immigrant population, and like 80% of them are old. And so we really begin to Americanize our population in a very aggressive way. But unfortunately, Hart-Celler in 1965, which is our current immigration act and regime, basically undoes all that in a dramatic way and opens up our doors to tons of communities, including those with very little to no historical ties to the United States.
Yeah. I want to know one question for you personally. Are you optimistic?
As a Christian, I believe pessimism is a sin.
Okay.
And I mean, I really do believe that. I understand it. Before any of your theologically minded viewers yell at me, yes, I understand this is different than the kind of narrow.
Yeah,
but
well,
I do
still fill out the questions in the comments because it's really good for the algorithm. So if anybody wants to tear it out,
if that idiot doesn't understand that was through Jesus Christ only and not with respect to any of man's constructions, I get it. Thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah,
but I do sort of think that in a certain way. And I think we have overcome, as I say in the book, more stringent challenges even than this. I don't want to minimize what we've got here in terms of a challenge because I think it's very, very substantial. But I wouldn't go so far as to say I'm optimistic, but I'm not. I don't in any way feel that the situation is hopeless. If I felt it was hopeless, I wouldn't have written the book. I would just have added a few more arms to my collection, which is never a bad thing to do anyway. But so I think we can solve this, and I think American people still have goodwill. We still have a lot of pride in the country. And I think people just need to accept right now, and this is what the book is about, even though the solutions are important, what I'm just trying to get people to agree right now is, hey, the problem's a problem. And then from there, we can begin to talk about what are the best ways to solve it.
Perfect. Well, we're so glad you wrote the book. Thank you so much for coming on The Wade Show. And we're glad to have you in town.
Great. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.